You're listening to Exodus of Ice, Book 1 of the series, The Fourth Reich, written by Don Spivey. This is a long-form science fiction audio narrative. If you enjoy this story, you can find the full series and future novellas on this channel. Please like, subscribe, and hit that bell notification to be informed when future releases of this and other series on our channel become available. Our story begins.
Exodus of Ice, Part 1. The World Ends. Quietly. Dr. Stan Reynolds had been staring at the same equation for nearly 20 minutes when the noise started. It wasn't loud at first, just a low, distant rumble of voices bleeding through the thick concrete walls of the observatory labs, the kind of background movement you learn to ignore when you spent enough time underground. He had learned that trick early in his career. Ignore the noise, trust the math, assume everything else would sort itself out. This time, it didn't. The rumble grew sharper, more urgent. Footsteps echoed in the corridor outside his office. Fast ones, running by the sound of it. People didn't run down here. These were scientists, not soldiers. The labs were 25 stories below the lunar surface, buried under layers of regolith and reinforced plating designed to shrug off micrometeor impacts and solar flares. Panic had no practical application at that depth. Something was wrong. Reynolds looked up from his cluttered desk, blinking as if he'd been pulled out of a light sleep. His office was a disaster in the way only a scientist's office could be, with data slates stacked in uneven towers, printed graphs taped to the walls, and coffee cups abandoned in various stages of fossilization. He pushed his chair back and stood, craning his long, almost giraffe-like neck over the rims of his square-framed reading glasses. The hallway beyond his door was full. People were moving past in clusters. Other scientists, a few uniformed security personnel, even 2 members of project management he recognized by sight. They were all heading in the same direction. The observatory viewing stations. Reynolds frowned. That alone was enough to spike his curiosity. The Moon-based Universal Radio Wave Spectrometer, MUS as everyone called it, didn't generate crowds unless something had gone catastrophically wrong or unimaginably right. Most days it was neither. Most days it was quiet, methodical work, data collection, long-term monitoring, watching the universe do exactly what it had always done. In other words, boring. He stepped out into the hallway and joined the flow, moving with the stragglers toward the viewing terminals. As he walked, fragments of conversation drifted past him. Confirmed the signal twice. Can't be interference, the pattern's wrong. Tell Global we need verification now. That last one tightened something in his chest. The observatory labs were tied directly into the largest telescope ever constructed by mankind. MUS had been built more than 2 centuries earlier, during the aftermath of the last Great War, World War Final, as it was now known. The war that had ended when Earth's nation-states finally stopped pretending they could survive alone. That war had almost wiped them out. Earth's infighting, its endless lust for power and resources, had left humanity fractured and vulnerable. The colonies, Venus, Mars, Europa, had seen an opportunity. They needed water, they needed materials, and they were tired of living under Earth's thumb. Europa had water, sure, a whole moon of it, locked under kilometers of ice, but melting it, cleaning it, making it potable, then shipping it across the solar system to Venus and Mars was a logistical nightmare. Earth controlled the ships, Earth controlled trade, Earth controlled the taps. For 100 years that balance held. Then the colonies tried to break it. They miscalculated. Badly. Earth unified in a way it never had before. Fleets were mobilized, supply lines weaponized. 5 brutal years later, the colonies were defeated. Not annihilated, just broken enough to take the fight out of them. In the end, cooler heads prevailed. The colonists were still human after all. Brothers and sisters, parents and children. When the treaties were signed, the rhetoric was lofty and hopeful. One humanity, one future, shared survival. It had worked, mostly. For 200 years, humanity had come together, working not for petty self-interests, but for the common good of all. Reynolds stepped into the viewing room and stopped short. The place was packed. Scientists crowded around the central display wall, faces lit pale blue by the glow of raw data streams. Engineers whispered to one another in tight, urgent bursts. Security officers stood rigid near the doors, hands clasped behind their backs, eyes fixed on the screens. Dr. Jameis from Stellar Materials stood directly in front of the primary viewer, motionless. His team analyzed everything MUS pulled in from deep space: dust, debris, spectral anomalies, the occasional oddity that made for a good conference paper. Reynolds took up a position just behind him and leaned forward. "What are we looking at?" he asked. Jameis didn't answer. Reynolds followed his gaze to the screen and felt the air leave his lungs in a slow, involuntary breath. At first glance, it looked like a city. That was the only word his brain could settle on, even as it struggled to process what it was seeing. A massive structure was moving into the outer boundary of the solar system, its silhouette cutting cleanly against the black. There were no fine details yet, just shape and motion, but the outline was unmistakable. A hull, long, wide, vast beyond any scale Reynolds could comfortably hold in his head. A faint blue glow burned at the rear of the object, steady and controlled. Engine exhaust. Whatever was driving it was powerful enough to push something that large at a speed that made his stomach tighten. "This can't be real," he whispered, more to himself than anyone else. Jameis finally spoke, his voice flat, distant. "It is." Reynolds swallowed. Is that what I think it is?" "Yes." The confirmation landed like a physical blow. In the entire history of Earth, no machine had ever been built to rival what was now drifting into their system. Not in size, not in speed, not in intent. This wasn't a probe. It wasn't debris. It wasn't a natural phenomenon that could be cataloged and filed away. It was coming toward them. The room erupted. Orders were shouted. Consoles lit up as analysts began hammering commands into their terminals. Phones rang, unanswered at first, then picked up and shouted into. Someone called for global command. Someone else called for interplanetary comms. Reynolds barely registered it as the klaxons began to wail. The main lights dimmed. Red emergency lighting flooded the room, painting everything in harsh, pulsing color. For a brief, ridiculous moment, Reynolds half expected something ancient and terrible to crawl out of the walls. Demons, ghouls, anything to make sense of the feeling settling in his gut. "What the hell is that thing?" Dr. Avis Morin shouted as she pushed through the crowd toward him. "I don't know," Reynolds said, already moving. He ran, back toward his office, fingers flying over his slate as he rerouted the live feed to his personal terminal. Data poured in faster than he could consciously process it. "It's big," he said, more firmly now, the scientist in him clawing back control. 7 miles long, 5 wide, rough estimate. Velocity. Jesus, 5% of light speed. Morin froze. Trajectory? Reynolds stared at the readout as the system refined the solution. His mouth went dry. Europa. The room went silent. "Sir," someone said quietly, "it's headed for the colony." Morin snapped back to life. "Get me interplanetary comms, now." As Reynolds established the link and pushed the data upstream, a cold realization settled over him. Today had started so normally. Now, it had officially entered uncharted territory. Dr. Reynolds hated uncharted. Names on the hull. Commander Benjamin Roberts was not a man who panicked. He had been trained out of it years ago, drilled until his instincts were wired to procedure instead of emotion. He was the kind of person you put in charge of a crisis precisely because he did not feel the crisis the same way everyone else did, or at least he didn't show it. He didn't raise his voice unless there was a reason. He didn't make dramatic statements. He didn't waste time on words when actions were required. Right now, though, he could feel the panic anyway, right under the skin, crawling around like a living thing. It wasn't the kind of panic that made you scream or run in circles. It was the kind that made your stomach tighten and your hands go cold even as you forced them to stay steady. Because the data packet that had just hit his terminal wasn't just abnormal, it was impossible. Roberts moved fast down the corridor, not running yet, but walking with that clipped, aggressive pace that told everyone around him something was wrong without him ever needing to say it. People stepped out of his way instinctively. Aides looked up from their consoles and then looked away, suddenly very interested in whatever they were doing. Security officers straightened as he passed. Somewhere behind him, klaxons were still cycling, and the emergency lights had that ugly red pulse that made everything feel like a warning. It was meant to keep people calm, ironically, by telling them the system was working. It rarely did. It just reminded everyone that they were one mechanical failure away from darkness and vacuum. Major Stenwell caught up beside him, breathing hard, a loose stack of printed pages clenched in his right hand. Stenwell was Robert's valet in the old sense of the word, meaning he was the man who handled everything before it became public, everything that was too raw or too incomplete to be released into the wider chain of command. He had a way of appearing at exactly the right moment with exactly the right document, like the universe itself had assigned him the role of making sure Roberts never walked into a room blind. Roberts glanced at him. "What is it, Major?" Stenwell's face was pale under the corridor lights, his eyes wide in a way Roberts almost never saw on a career officer. That alone was enough to make Roberts' grip tighten on the data slate in his hand. "You're not going to believe this, sir," Stenwell said, still trying to catch his breath. But the analyzer found writing on the vessel. Roberts stopped dead. It wasn't a dramatic stop. He didn't skid or stumble. He just halted, like someone had flipped a switch. The aides behind him nearly collided with his back. "What kind of writing?" Roberts asked, and he heard the edge in his own voice. He didn't like that. He didn't like anything that pulled him off center. Stenwell held the papers out. Roberts yanked them from his hand and scanned the analysis breakdown, eyes moving fast, mind trying to reject the conclusion before it could settle. "German, sir," Stenwell said quietly. Roberts looked up. "German?" Stenwell nodded. "Our linguists confirmed it. Multiple passes. It's not artifacting. It's not pattern pareidolia. It's German." Roberts felt the panic finally press harder, not outward, not visible, but inside, squeezing. German wasn't just a language. It was a ghost, a relic, a cultural scar that still lived in textbooks and memorials, and the formal language of treaties written in the aftermath of catastrophe. German was the voice of an old enemy, one almost forgotten to history. "Well," Roberts said, and his tone flattened into something controlled again. "Are you going to make me guess? What does it say?" Stenwell's mouth opened, then closed. He seemed to hesitate, like even he didn't want to be the one to speak it out loud. Then he said it anyway. "KMS Bismarck II, sir." Roberts stared at him. "It's a goddamned German warship," Stenwell added, his face pinched, eyes tight. He wiped the sweat off his forehead as he waited for the commander to process the new information. Roberts looked down at the paper again, as if staring harder would change what was printed there. The analyzer output showed the characters cleanly, pulled from the hull imaging. It wasn't a guess. It was an identification. KMS Bismarck II. The original Bismarck had been sunk over 5 centuries ago. Everyone knew that. It was history. It was legend. It was the kind of story kids learned in school as proof that no machine, no empire, no ambition was invincible. So what the hell was this? "How in hell could that be possible?" Roberts muttered. Not because he expected an answer, but because saying it out loud was the only way to keep his mind from running off the cliff edge. Stenwell didn't respond. There was nothing useful to say. Roberts started moving again, faster now. He didn't care if people saw him hurry. He didn't care if it looked like panic. He had one job. Get this to the president. Roberts didn't enjoy being in those rooms. He didn't enjoy politics, the careful phrasing, the way leaders spoke as if every sentence was being archived for a future that might never arrive. But he understood why it mattered. Words shaped response. Response shaped survival. He rounded the final corridor and hit the security checkpoint leading to the executive briefing wing. Guards snapped to attention, scanners beeped, authorization codes flashed green. Doors opened. As he walked, he realized something else, something that made the hair on his arms rise despite the controlled temperature of the facility. If this ship had German writing on its hull, it meant one of two things. Either someone out there had decided to mimic old Earth symbols as a psychological weapon, which would be disturbing enough, or what? He wondered. This can't be real. How can it? Robert's stomach was doing flips under his skin as he made his way to the briefing room doors. The briefing room doors slid open and swallowed him into sterile white light and polished floors, the kind of room designed to feel calm even when reality was anything but. Aides looked up. Someone started to speak. Roberts held up the papers without looking at them. "This cannot wait," he said. And as he walked toward the inner chamber where the president and the senior counsel would be assembled, the thought kept pressing at the back of his mind, growing heavier with every step. What if this was real? Then history had not been a straight line. It had been a circle. Antarctica, 1945. The mountain in Antarctica did not look like a door. It looked like what it was, a wall of snow and ice piled over ancient stone, a dead place in a dead continent, locked in winter darkness so completely it felt like the planet itself had forgotten this region existed. There was no sunlight, not this time of year. The sky was black, the stars sharp and cold. Wind screamed across the ridges and made the surface snow move like living skin. No sane person would have built anything here. That was precisely why it had worked. At 2:17 local time, a deep red glow appeared on the mountainside. At first, it was faint, almost subtle, like someone had buried a flare inside the rock and forgotten it. Then it brightened, pulsing, intensifying in steady increments. Snow hissed and steamed where the heat licked it. Ice began to crack, tiny fractures spiderwebbing outward as pressure rose behind the mountain face. Then the entire side of the mountain burst outward in a violent eruption of snow, ice, and stone. A perfect circular tunnel yawned open in the crater of the blast, drilled straight into the heart of the mountain, so deep the darkness inside it looked solid. The edges were reinforced with metal ribs and segmented plating, engineered like the throat of a machine. For a moment, nothing moved. The wind screamed, snow fell, the red glow faded as darkness returned. Then a roar exploded out of the tunnel and the ground itself seemed to flinch. Something massive began to come forward. The doors close. The thing emerging from the mountain did not hurry. That was what struck the men watching it first. Not its size, not the violence of the engines, not even the way the ice vaporized beneath it as red-hot exhaust slammed into the tunnel floor hard enough to turn packed snow into boiling fog. It moved with patience. A monstrous metal shape slid forward, hovering inches above the ground, suspended by raw thrust alone. Its hull was layered steel, riveted and scarred, with exposed structural ribs running the length of its cylindrical body, like the bones of some mechanical animal. Antenna arrays bristled along its spine, rotating slowly, deliberately. Early radar dishes turned on visible mechanical joints, not hidden behind smooth housings. There was nothing sleek about it, nothing graceful. It was built to endure. As more of the ship cleared the tunnel mouth, the scale became impossible to ignore. It was over a mile long, its bulk swallowing the mountain behind it, its shadow stretching across the ice like a stain. Rear engines ignited fully, their thunder rolling outward in waves that cracked the frozen ground and shook loose avalanches from distant ridges. Men on the ice fell to one knee, hands pressed to helmets, teeth rattling inside their skulls. And then the lights appeared on the horizon, headlamps. Dozens at first, then hundreds, cutting white tunnels through the black as American snow machines and Russian tracked transports tore across the ice at maximum speed. Engines screamed. Radio chatter filled the air, sharp and frantic. The Allied forces had arrived with minutes to spare, racing toward a base they had only learned about hours earlier, buried deep in the captured secrets of Berlin. They were too late. 14 more tunnels opened along the mountainside, one after another, like wounds splitting the rock open. 14 more ships emerged, identical in design, each sliding into position with mechanical precision. All 15 of the ark-ships' engines idled in perfect synchronization, a low, unified hum that vibrated through the ice and into the bones of everyone watching. The fleet aligned itself without a single shouted command. Missiles streaked upward from the advancing Allied columns, contrails carving bright lines through the darkness. The first detonations blossomed against the nearest hulls, flashes of orange and white that lit the ice field like artificial suns. The missiles struck armored plating and deflected harmlessly, detonating without leaving scorch marks or visible damage. The ships did not alter course. They did not accelerate. They made no response at all to the insects below them. From the tunnel mouths below, German soldiers poured out in disciplined waves, rifles raised, screaming as they charged the advancing forces. Their faces were set, grim and resolved. They knew exactly what they were there to do: delay, distract, die if necessary. Gunfire ripped across the ice. Artillery thundered. Bodies fell and froze where they landed, blood already darkening as it cooled against the snow. Above them, the ships lifted. Slowly at first, noses tilting skyward, engines burning hotter as millions upon millions of tons of thrust slammed into the ground. Columns of fire and smoke roared beneath each vessel as they climbed, punching through cloud layers and into the upper atmosphere. Within minutes, they were glowing points against the void. Then nothing at all. Levi Ben Orr felt the vibration before he heard the order. The lower decks of the Bismarck II shook with the controlled violence of ascent, metal groaning as stresses were distributed through the hull. He stood in line with dozens of others, hands clasped tight in front of him, eyes fixed on the floor. Guards moved along the line, boots striking metal with sharp, deliberate rhythm. "Step forward," one of them barked. A man ahead of Levi hesitated for half a second too long. A hand grabbed his collar and yanked him out of line, shoving him toward a corridor Levi did not recognize. The man's wife reached for him, fingers brushing his sleeve. A rifle butt slammed into her stomach. She folded without a sound. Levi did not move. He had learned early not to move unless told. The corridor filled quickly. People were herded forward in uneven groups, voices rising in confusion, fear leaking through in whispers and sobs. Children cried openly until someone, usually a parent, pressed a hand over their mouth, not to comfort them, but to quiet them. They all knew better than to scream. Levi was pulled backward, separated from the press of bodies moving ahead. Strong hands gripped his shoulders and shoved him toward the opposite wall. Others were dragged back with him, men with broad shoulders, women with technical badges sewn into their worn clothing, a few older children who looked confused rather than terrified. "Stand there," a guard snapped. Levi stood. He watched as the bulkhead doors at the far end of the corridor began to close. At first, no one understood what was happening. People pressed forward, thinking it was some kind of checkpoint, some kind of staging delay. Then the doors kept moving, thick slabs of reinforced metal sliding together with a grinding sound that carried through the corridor like a death sentence. Someone screamed. Hands slammed against the closing seam. A child slipped and vanished beneath the press of bodies. Levi saw his mother's face in the crowd, eyes wide, mouth forming his name without sound. He tried to move. A rifle barrel pressed into his chest and held him in place. The doors met. The sound was final. No alarms sounded. No announcements were made. The corridor lights did not change. The ship did not pause its ascent. The universe did not acknowledge what had just happened. Levi stood there, breathing, while everyone he loved disappeared behind a wall that would never open again. Kapitan Wilhelm Kessler watched the status board update in silence. "Section 0 sealed," an officer reported. Kessler nodded once. "Proceed." There was no hesitation in his voice, no visible reaction at all. The decision had been made, and his only concern was the continuation of the Reich. He did not ask who had been inside. He did not need to. The ship needed to survive. Everything else was secondary. In the lower decks, Levi slid down the wall and pressed his forehead to his knees. No one spoke to him. No one needed to. The others who had been pulled back understood exactly what had happened. They had been spared. not out of mercy, out of usefulness. An older man crouched beside him and spoke quietly, his voice low enough that it barely carried. "Listen," he said, "you remember this, but you don't say it. You don't write it. You don't ask about it. Ever." Levi looked up, eyes dry and burning. "Why?" he asked. The man's jaw tightened. "Because the memory carries their shame, and it bears witness to the blood of our people." The ship shuddered as it cleared the atmosphere. Somewhere above them, Earth shrank into a pale blue dot, then into nothing at all. Levi closed his eyes. The doors had closed, but the memory did not. What is said, what is not? The official story was ready within the hour. Oberlehrer Elias Kraus stood alone in the small doctrine chamber just off the command deck, hands folded behind his back, eyes fixed on the blank wall that would soon carry the words. The chamber had been intended for briefings, nothing more. Functional, efficient, free of ornamentation. Kraus liked it that way. Empty spaces were easier to fill. He spoke softly as he dictated, his voice measured, calm, entirely reasonable. During ascent, non-essential compartments were sealed in accordance with launch protocols, he said. Several hundred individuals were lost due to structural necessity and unavoidable mechanical constraints. He paused, considering. "Lost," he repeated, nodding slightly. "Yes, that will do." There was no mention of families, no mention of selection, no mention of doors closing while people screamed on the other side. The language framed the event as impersonal, technical, tragic in the abstract, but blameless in execution. A cost, not a choice. Kraus continued, refining phrases, shaping meaning the way a craftsman shaped metal. Propaganda was not about lies, not exactly. It was about deciding which truths were useful and which ones were not. When he was finished, the story was transmitted ship-wide. Most people accepted it without question. They were exhausted, grieving in private ways, focused on survival. The lie did not feel like a lie yet. It felt like relief. An explanation that allowed them to move forward without asking questions that would only hurt. Kraus allowed himself a thin, private smile. Belief, he knew, was easier to maintain than truth. Besides, they were only Juden rats. On the lower decks, belief did not matter. Levi sat with the others in a maintenance bay that smelled of oil and cold metal. The engine's distant thunder vibrated through the walls, a constant reminder that the ship was still accelerating, still moving farther away from anything that could ever hold them accountable. An elder spoke quietly, his voice carrying the weight of someone who had already lost more than most. "They will say it was an accident," he said. "They will say it was necessary. They will say it was unfortunate." He looked at Levi and the others, meeting each of their eyes in turn. "They will never say it was a choice." No one argued. No one needed to. That night, if night could be said to exist anymore, the elders gathered those who had survived the separation. They spoke without writing anything down. Names were recited softly, then repeated, then spoken again by someone else, until they lived in memory rather than ink. "This is how we keep them," the elder said. "We do not give the ship something it can erase." They agreed on rules that felt instinctive, almost obvious in their necessity. No written records, no open gatherings, no shared symbols. Memory would pass from mouth to ear, from generation to generation, hidden in work routines and quiet rituals that looked like nothing at all. Levi listened. He remembered. He understood even then that this was not resistance. It was survival. Time passed differently after that. The days blurred together, marked not by sunlight or darkness, but by shifts and maintenance cycles. Levi learned his work quickly. He was good with his hands, precise, careful. The guards noticed. That made him valuable, which made him safer, in a limited way. He never forgot the sound the doors made when they closed. Sometimes he thought he heard it again, in the distant thud of bulkheads sealing or the echo of pressure locks cycling. His body reacted before his mind did, muscles tense, breath catching. He never spoke of it. Above him, on the higher decks, the Reich settled into motion. Systems stabilized, hierarchies solidified, orders were issued and followed. The escape was declared a success. The lie hardened. Levi found the viewport by accident. It was tucked into a narrow corridor rarely used, its thick glass scratched and clouded. He stood there for a long time, staring out into the black, searching for something he knew wasn't there anymore. Earth was gone, not destroyed, not conquered, just absent, reduced to memory, a place that would someday be reclaimed, according to the words broadcast from above. Levi pressed his palm against the glass. He did not think about revenge. He did not imagine justice. He thought about endurance, about remembering what had been taken, even when remembering hurt, about waiting. Because waiting, he understood now, was something the Reich had never learned how to do. What remains? The engines never stopped. That was the first thing Levi noticed once the shock wore off enough for routine to take hold. No matter where he was on the ship, lower decks, maintenance corridors, forgotten access shafts, the vibration was always there. A low, steady reminder that they were moving, that nothing behind them could be reached again, no matter how hard someone might want it. Above him, life continued as if the doors had never closed. People worked. People slept. Children were born. The ship's internal calendar was formalized and broadcast ship-wide, its days and cycles enforced with the same efficiency as everything else. Ceremonies were held to mark the success of the launch. Speeches were given, carefully worded, praising discipline and sacrifice and destiny. No one spoke the names Levi carried in his head. That silence was not accidental. It spread quickly, the way all useful behaviors did. Questions were met with redirection. Redirection became expectation. Expectations hardened into habit. By the end of the first year, it was as if Section 0 had never existed at all, except below. In the maintenance levels, among the people who had been pulled back from the line, the rules were already changing. They worked longer hours. They were assigned the tasks no one else wanted, jobs that involved radiation exposure, confined spaces, systems that killed slowly and without drama when they failed. They did the work without complaint, not because they were loyal, because they understood what non-compliance looked like. Levi watched older men bend under the weight of responsibility that had nothing to do with rank. He saw women teach children how to disappear in plain sight, how to speak when spoken to and not a word more. He learned which corridors were watched and which ones were forgotten, which guards looked through people and which ones looked at them. Knowledge became currency. Memory became burden. One evening, if evening was still the right word, the elder who had spoken to him after the doors closed sat beside Levi in the dim light of a service alcove. The ship hummed around them, vast and uncaring. "You need to understand something," the elder said quietly. What they did wasn't just to kill. It was to teach. Levi nodded. He already knew. "They wanted us to learn that resistance ends in silence," the elder continued. "That survival means obedience. That memory is dangerous." He paused, then added, "They were right about one thing." Levi looked at him. "Memory is dangerous," the elder said. "That's why we keep it." From that night on, Levi practiced remembering with intent. He repeated names silently while he worked. He marked time by events instead of dates, the day the engines changed pitch, the day the guard rotation shifted, the day the ship passed far enough from Sol that the stars no longer looked familiar. Years later, when Levi had children of his own, he taught them the same way. Not with stories, exactly. Stories could be questioned. Stories could be twisted. He taught them with absences. "This corridor doesn't exist," he would say, and they would nod, understanding that it did. "This door never opens," and they would remember the sound of it closing, even if they had never heard it themselves. Some questions are not asked, and they would learn when to lower their eyes. Above them, the Reich grew orderly, efficient, certain. Captain Kessler's name was recorded in official logs as the man who had shepherded humanity into exile. His decisions were praised as necessary. His image, captured in a single formal portrait, was reproduced in gathering halls and educational spaces. Below, Levi never spoke the name out loud. He did not need to. He knew that power liked to believe it was eternal. He knew that systems built on silence eventually forgot what they were hiding. And he knew something else, something small but stubborn, something the Reich had overlooked in its careful planning. Memory, unlike steel, did not fatigue. It did not crack under pressure. It waited. Levi stood at the viewport one last time before his shift began, staring into the black where Earth had once been. He pressed his palm to the glass again, not in farewell, but in acknowledgement. They had sealed the doors, they had erased the records. They had done everything right, according to their own logic. And still, something remained. Levi turned away and went back to work, carrying the weight of names that no one else would ever record, trusting that one day, far beyond his lifetime, beyond his children's, beyond the reach of any voice he would ever hear, the memory he guarded would matter. Not because it demanded justice, but because justice demanded it endure.
Thank you for listening to Exodus of Ice, Book 1 in the Fourth Reich series. The story continues in the next novella of the Fourth Reich. Select the next video to continue. If you love our story, please like, subscribe, and hit the bell so you can stay in the loop for our new releases. Thanks for listening.